How important are your Microsoft 365 emails? Backing up your data for disaster recovery purposes is important, but archiving your business email is a complementary best practice. You need both to keep your emails protected, preserved, and available, not only for regulatory purposes. Many businesses that are using cloud services or are in the process of migrating to the cloud falsely believe that no dedicated protection for their data in the cloud is necessary. This is not the case, and here's why email archiving is still important. Even though Microsoft is a service provider, with Microsoft 365, the responsibility to protect or preserve your data is not theirs. For example, what happens if you accidentally delete an email? Losing important emails may result in a loss of business-critical data. There are limited ways in Microsoft 365 to recover deleted emails, but there is no guarantee for success. If you don't want to bother your IT admin, hoping to find and restore emails you just can't locate, a professional email archiving solution can help. If you want to learn more about this, download this white paper and find out about the benefits of third-party email archiving for businesses using Microsoft 365 now.
That's it. You just cannot escape advertising anywhere you go now. I hope you don't mind me adding that. That was a brand new 365 animated explainer. You guys all in the partner channel reseller community, and I thought you might like to know that's now available. So if you'd like to use it on your site, you can do. It talked about a white paper, an Osterman white paper, so that's obviously also available for download. Thanks a lot for joining me for this reseller drop-in. Always good to have you here, spending some of your time here. Really good to talk to you. It's been a busy week at MailStore. We've been getting 13 out the door, version 13. There's been lots in there, and we're really looking forward to talking to you about it. Just before I get started, 2 weeks ago, we had a really good drop-in, and it was, I shouldn't sound so surprised. We had a really good drop-in, and it was with LMS, one of our SPE partners. So if you've thought about providing MailStore as a service on your own infrastructure, definitely check that one out. It's basically it'll be in the description, so feel free to give us a shout about that one. Version 13 last week was easily missed. The significance of it was easily missed, and I think we did internally to some of that in the sales teams at least anyway. And it included modern authentication, which is really quite a big deal. And so I'm really pleased to have my colleague here who's going to help me out shortly. He knows far more about it than I do. But before I introduce him, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what the plan is for today. So it's quite a techie topic, which is great to have my colleague along, Daniel. The plan for this session is to give you some background about what this is all about. It's really important, not just for MailStore, but for software vendors, for your customers. It's a big new change, the move to modern authentication. So we're going to do a bit of demystifying the technology. So Daniel's going to do his absolute best to explain this. I've asked him to explain it to us as if I'm his grandma, basically, and keep it nice and simple. We're going to show you how we've implemented it in MailStore. Going to talk very briefly about why it's important for your customers, why they care about this stuff. And then hopefully we'll have a good Q&A session. I've got a funny feeling that, there's going to be a few questions at the end. So yeah, plenty to keep us occupied. So without further ado, Daniel, This is Director of Engineering at MailStore, Daniel Weuthen. I'm determined to get that right. How are you doing?
Sounds good. Sounds awesome. Hello, everyone.
Excellent. Good to have you on board finally. How's the
Yes.
last week been?
Yeah, it's been an interesting week. I mean, we have worked quite long on version 13, getting all that new fancy stuff into that version. Looks quite good. Went all well. So we are happy with the start. And yeah, we're really looking forward to see more and more people moving to modern authentication and use it. And as you'll learn throughout this session, there are good reasons for you guys to switch over. So yeah.
Excellent.
And for those who haven't had the chance to meet me in person, this is my actually 12th year at MailStore, so my 11th anniversary a month ago. That means I joined MailStore in 2009, and I proudly can say that I was the 6th employee at that time. So I have seen this company growing and yeah, contributed a little bit to the growth of the company. I've been responsible for the tech support the first years until 2015, before I started occupying the role of director engineering. And yeah, I'm love my team. I love to work with these guys, these experts on their fields, and building these great products, and especially take care about the quality. Before I joined MailStore, actually, and maybe that's interesting to our resellers. I worked at something, yeah, you previously called ISP, so we're a typical internet service provider, which was quite regional here in that area around Düsseldorf, and they also provide IT service to walls, virus scanners, and so on. But also set up email server infrastructure with antivirus, anti-spam technologies built in. Learned a lot about Linux and especially about all the background technology that is built into what we know as products. But doing that all basically on a Linux server that really teaches you a lot of the protocols and everything that's going on behind the scenes. So, yeah, that's my origin.
Definitely part of the furniture, and that's really interesting. The background and the fact that you've worked at an MSP and still, I hope you don't mind me mentioning, you still do work, still keep your foot in with some tech support for small businesses. So you're still in touch with the smaller companies.
One business. Yeah, just one business. This is a very small business of a friend of mine in the real estate business, and at some point I couldn't see how longer he was struggling with the challenges of modern IT, and I said, okay, let me help you out, and actually that's where I can see how MailStore works for a small business, just 5 users. But they have a mixed environment with local Active Directory and Office 365, Microsoft 365. Sorry, I'm still used to saying Office 365. With Microsoft 365 for collaboration and email and with seeing the change now between the previous MailStore versions and now version 13, I can really see that this is useful for even those smaller environments with all the benefits you, James, mentioned initially, but makes it also easier for end users. Yeah, that keeps me touching ground with all the hard work our resellers are doing on a daily basis, and yeah.
That's good. Good to learn a bit about you before we get stuck into the hardcore stuff. So, listen, I'll come right back to you in a second. I'm just going to give the guys a bit of an overview of why we're talking about modern authentication all of a sudden. And it was back in February that both Microsoft and Google announced that they were going to be withdrawing the possibility of using just a basic username and passwords for users to authenticate with their email services. So they're switching to basically what is a token-based system. So the application shouldn't hold the password, basically, shouldn't hold those credentials. It uses a token-based system instead. So I'm not going to get into that. Daniel's much better at covering that than me. But the important thing is something is happening, and the deadline for this was October. So pre-COVID, the idea was this was going to be switched off by both vendors in October. So that's really important, obviously, because you're going to have customers knocking on your door. I hope you're aware of this already, but if you're not, this is hopefully a good, opportune reminder. So we've had I've actually had a look today at an update, and this is where it stands right now. So if you basically, if you bring start up any new tenants on the, we're talking about 365 now, it will be disabled by default. So basic authentication won't be an option for you. If you've got no sign of having used it in recently, so you just have, there's no one set up using basic authentication, then it will also be disabled. But the important deadline is the second half of next year is when they're actually going to blanket turn it off. So I think the best thing to do really is to be, if you can, to be gearing up for, October was the original date. I think anything after that is a bonus. So I think, bear in mind that that's really when it's kind of, crunch time, and that's when we need to be doing something. So to explain what it is all about, basic authentication, modern authentication, I'll shoot back to Daniel, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you, James. So before we learn more about modern authentication, I would like to talk what basic authentication actually means. And before going into details, I would start with an analogy. Let's pretend you flying aboard and you leave the plane at the airport and you go to the border control. And now let's pretend things work a little bit differently than what we are all used to. So instead of showing your passport, you would just tell the security officer, hey, my name is Daniel and my password is blah, blah, blah. And I am originally from Germany. So with that information, that security officer would pick up a phone and give the national authorities in Germany a call and say, hey, here's a guy at my desk, and his name is Daniel, and he wants to enter my country, and he said his password is blah, blah, blah. And what happens if the national authority would say, oh, yeah, that information is correct. He's a citizen here, and we know this is a password. That's correct. You can leave him in. So then security officer says, okay, your information is correct, and you just feel free and enter my country. So that sounds not right, does it? So what's wrong with that approach if border control would work like that? So first of all, there are no additional checks. There is no passport, there is no photo on it. So how does that guy know that I am really the person I pretend to be? It's just not possible, because anyone who knows my password and who knows who I am could give that information to the security officer, and with that little information, he would always be authenticated as that person, right? The other thing is that I have to give away information that is supposed to remain a secret to another person, which is the security officer. That means I unconditionally have to trust that person. And yes, for most countries, I would feel okay with that, maybe, but for others, probably not. So let's try to transfer that kind of authentication into the digital world. And that is actually what basic authentication is. So originally, the term basic authentication is an authentication scheme that is defined in an RFC that was initially created for HTTP authentication. So if you open your browser, go to a website, and there is this browser or Windows-like pop-up asking you to enter username and password, that is exactly what is described with that. The username and password are encoded and sent to the server. No more information can be asked from the user using that authentication mechanism. And this kind of authentication, the technology behind it, that has been used in Microsoft Exchange servers for ages, when having an application talking to the Exchange server using the WebDAV protocol in the old Exchange versions, or Exchange Web Service in the newer versions. So if we today say basic authentication, we actually mean a simple authentication or a plain text authentication. That means just a username and a password, maybe a little bit encoded, but not in a way that is really secure. And Google, for example, has this umbrella term called less secure apps, but that also refers to applications that send a username and a password over. And that's basically it. If we say basic authentication, we mean something that authenticates by just sending a plain username and a password and nothing more. So as we learned in this airport analogy, there are certain issues with that kind of authentication. And in the digital world, the thing is, the one who owns the credentials, that is the one who knows the username and the password, is actually kind of the owner of the resource. And if you give it away to another person, he becomes the owner of your resources that originally were owned by you. But the service where the resources are stored, that cannot distinguish between you and a different person. Talking about Microsoft 365 or Google, that means if you just want to give someone access to your mailbox, he could as well use the same username and password to look into SharePoint, in Teams, on all other services on the Microsoft or similar services in your Google account and get access to that data. And unfortunately, with that technology available based on this basic authentication, it's barely possible to limit the access for someone to certain resources. So you see a lot of issues, wide open gates to your data that should be protected on various systems, and that's kind of risky. So if that all sounds so terrible, why actually accept, or do we accept, this kind of authentication in the digital world for so long? It doesn't make sense in my analogy, and it should not make sense in the digital world as well. So what is modern authentication then, and what issues does it solve? So first of all, the term modern authentication is an umbrella term that has been defined by Microsoft, but we at MailStore, and I think many others will do as well, also use that term to describe the set of various authentication methods. So how somebody or something logs into a system, of authorization methods, mechanisms that make sure that you have not full access by default to something, and conditional access policies, which means that you define under which conditions certain additional steps have to be taken in order to log into a system. So back to the MailStore, to the airport story. What does that mean? Actually, it means what we do in our real world today. You go to the security officer at the border control check, and he will take a passport from you, and on that passport he finds certain information. And if we talk about roles and terms in this modern authentication world, the passport would actually be an ID token. You will see that term later on again. And this ID token contains information, who you are, who created that token, which is your national authority, and how long it's valid, what is on there, and maybe some other attributes that could be useful in order to verify that it's really you, like your photo, for example. So we do have good and decent mechanisms in the digital world that relate very much to what we observe as security measures for critical systems in the real world, which are passports, or in the digital world, let's say it's ID tokens in that case. So while conditional access policies are somewhat proprietary, the authentication and authorization methods are not. And that is important to understand, and that's important to know if you have the fear that now we are building a world where you have multiple authentication, authorization mechanisms, and they're in a competition. No, they aren't, because the most essential parts are standardized. Whereas one thing is authorization. That's the OAuth 2 standard. And that's an industry standard. That's important to know. It's not invented by one company, by one organization. It's an industry standard that is supported by all major software vendors, especially by those who provide identity providers like Microsoft, Google, and probably Facebook, and maybe all the others you have seen on website where this button say log in with Yahoo account and whatsoever. Yeah, typically that's all based on OAuth 2 for years now. So the other thing is the authentication part. How can a user authenticate to a third-party service? And that is where OpenID Connect comes into play. This is not an industry standard, but that's also a standard that is widely used. And what is important to know is, although they serve a different purpose, they are very much related from a technology standpoint to each other. So the OpenID Connect protocol suite, that kind of extends the OAuth protocol. So it's based on the same technologies. It uses parts of OAuth, but it extends. The reason for that is that with OAuth itself, it was never the idea to use it to authenticate users, to authenticate a person. OAuth itself contains methods where a service can authenticate itself to another service in order to get certain token information and then do the real stuff like accessing email, accessing calendar items, and so on. But OAuth itself was never really designed to authenticate users. And that is why OpenID Connect was added in order to resolve that issue in a secure way. So with that little background information, I would give it back to James.
Yeah, that was good. That was really good. It's really nice to see the background, and I've got a layman question here, layman alert. When I saw modern authentication, I thought, oh, great, it's got two-factor authentication support. So 2FA and MFA weren't mentioned in this. So where does that fit into this piece, this puzzle?
Mm-hmm. 2FA, MFA, that's part of the authentication step, but that step itself is not really standardized. It's and we will see that later. You as the user connect to your identity provider that should validate that it's really you, and depending on the policies, and that is the part with the conditional access policies, your identity provider might ask you for further information. If he thinks just entering your username and your password is not enough to authenticate because you are connecting from an unknown network, an external network, a random internet IP, they might say, okay, I haven't seen this IP address and haven't seen anyone logging from that IP address, so I assume that's insecure. So let me ask the user for an additional information, like, hey, I've got your phone number, so I will send you a text message with the code in it, and then please enter it, because you should be the only person having your phone with you, for example. And Microsoft has implemented that in also very dynamic ways. So their systems may learn what is a secure system or not. For example, you may have seen login dialogues where you can say, hey, this is a secure device because it's your work computer and you know your IT took care of all the security measures. Yeah. Whereas if you're connecting from another computer, you would not check that box, for example, if it's from your personal computer, for example. And then you will get asked for your username and password every time you connect. Whereas if you define a device as secure, then you will only be asked once, and then a cookie is stored in your browser, and the next time you log in or you connect to that site, you're just logged in. Yeah, these are all the policy or the conditional access policies that an administrator can apply to that. As a result, yeah, from the authentication perspective, only the result matters, which is, does the user get an ID token that he can use to send to the service he initially wanted to log in? And that's it, right? If we talk about the standards, that's basically it.
Yeah. So this is all outside of MailStore. It's policies defined by the service itself, and which is, I mean, it's really particularly relevant now, isn't it? Because of the sort of the trend, obviously, for remote working, home working. The fact that you can define a policy that says, well, you do need 2FA if you're here, but you don't if we know you're in the office. That's really
absolutely. That's it. I mean, for example, if I am on the corporate VPN, that VPN ensures that I'm on a trusted device and that certain security settings on my device are correct. And then I don't have to enter further information like doing a multi-factor authentication. If I shut down the VPN, so I connect just from my home internet connection, I'm sending requests from an untrustworthy network, and in that case, I will have to enter further information when I log into corporate resources that are accessible through an internet connection. But as I'm from an insecure network, there is extra steps to take. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, it's quite a lot to get your head around, isn't it? But clearly, it's a far more secure, more sophisticated way of doing things, isn't it? So
it is. And the one of the biggest benefit for administrators is definitely that all these policies are just configured at one location, which is the identity provider or the system where the identity provider checks, hey, do I have to take additional steps or ask the user for more information? Which means the more applications you connect to this identity provider, and with identity provider, I know that we in most cases mean the Microsoft Azure Active Directory and their identity services provided by Microsoft. You only have to configure policies there. And every other application where a user could log in, which says, hey, please go to your identity provider and make sure you authenticate there and come back with an ID token. You don't have to configure individual login policy, security settings for each and every other single application. It's just one spot, one location where the administrator needs to do his job right. And then he also already covered the security, the login policies for all the applications that are integrated with that identity provider. And on the long run, the more applications support this way of authentication, the easier it is for the administrator. And the less overhead and the less worries he may have that he might have a system that is not secure, whereas other systems are secure. So I really hope that more and more picking up this trend, and I mean, Google and Microsoft are pushing really hard on that end to support modern authentication. And for cloud services, is kind of honestly a no-brainer, because most of them were developed in the last 5 to 10 years, where all that technology was available. I mean, if we look at MailStore and why was basic authentication and is so dominant, because MailStore is very flexible. It can talk to a lot of on-premise servers that don't support this all modern authentication stuff. And talking about Microsoft and Exchange, this modern authentication is not a feature you find in an on-premise Active Directory and on-premise Exchange server. So that will remain to work as is, and there are no plans to change that. And same for other products we support at MailStore. And if you look at the time when MailStore was invented, there was just no technology available other than, yes, give me a username and a password, and I will try to figure out if you are the right person, right?
Yeah, I know we've got a variety of resellers and distributors on this, so there's going to be definitely some interest around how this affects other mail platforms, MDM and Kerio, the others that we're working with. So anyway, I'm conscious of my questions are taking up the time of the people that are most important, the resellers, who are going to be asking some questions at the end. So are you ready? Should we have a quick look at how it's implemented in MailStore, what you guys have been working on over the past, how long has it been? When did you first start looking at this? I'm interested, actually.
First started looking at that was end of last year. I mean, we had this ticket to implement modern authentication in our backlog since 2018. That was the first time that Microsoft was announcing that they will be deprecating basic authentication for Exchange Web Services, and only for Exchange Web Services at that time. In the meanwhile, they are extending the deprecation policy, and they want to do it for POP3 and IMAP and SMTP as well. So we had that ticket in the backlog quite long. But with 2020, October 2020 approaching, working on other fantastic projects at the moment, that was the right time to start really looking into it. What was actually surprising to us was that out of nowhere, Google made an announcement, I think last November or December, that they are going to deprecate this basic authentication or less secure apps in G Suite within the next 6 months. And that was like, okay, we had a deadline that was October, and then out of nothing, Google just rushed by and said, okay, I'm going to do it within the next 6 months. And we're like, okay, now we have to pull pedal to the metal and do everything we can. So that is where you can imagine that was quite busy for 6 months, because originally we thought, we just need to do that for Microsoft, and then suddenly there was, okay, we need to do the same thing for Google. But luckily we have industry standards, so like I would say 89% of the code is the same for both implementations, right?
Right.
Yeah, but it took us quite a while to also get our heads wrapped around the whole new terminologies and the different roles and what is used there. It was a really fun time, because it was learning a lot of new stuff for the team. So you want to have a look at the MailStore way?
Let's see what you've been up to. Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay, first some theoretic background on that. So authentication. So where actually does MailStore need to authenticate, and what does it need to authenticate? So first of all, and I go through that list because that is typically when you set up MailStore, what are the steps you take. So the first time you get in touch with authentication is when you want MailStore to synchronize users from a directory service. Like, it doesn't matter if it's Active Directory, if it's Microsoft 365, G Suite, MDaemon, ICE, whatever. You have to tell MailStore, there is a server, and here is your username and password, and use that information to get the information out of that server that you need, basically. So that's the first thing to do. Then the other thing is when you tell MailStore, hey, please archive messages from mailboxes, you need to also provide credentials to MailStore that MailStore can log into the mailbox of the users and archive messages from there. And the last thing authentication matters in MailStore is when the user finally wants to log into MailStore and access the information that is stored in his MailStore archive. So the first thing is MailStore as a service running in the background needs to authenticate with a third party, with a directory service or with a mail server. In most cases, actually, that's the same authentication mechanism. And the other thing is MailStore or a third party needs to authenticate a user that should be able to access information stored in MailStore. Of course, MailStore does it on its own if the password is stored locally in MailStore. In all other cases, it's a third party. Now, the difference is, depending on the backend, of course, this is still valid with version 13. But if we look at the differences between authenticating MailStore user in previous versions with Microsoft 365, and in that case you can always replace it with Google G Suite as well, and how it's done today, we first look at basic authentication. So originally the user opens the client application, MailStore client, Outlook, get in, or the web browser, types in the username and the password, and sends it to MailStore. Then MailStore figures out, well, that is a user that I synchronized from a remote directory service. And MailStore connects to either the directory service itself, if that provides an authentication interface, or in case of Exchange servers and Office 365, the old profile, basic authentication, it takes the username and the password and tries to log into the Exchange mailbox of the user. If the Exchange server says, oh yeah, I'm fine, that login was correct, Exchange will reply that back to MailStore, and MailStore will tell the client application that the user uses, yes, okay, your username and password was correct. Please go ahead, and then the user starts search in the archive. MailStore returns a search result, and you see from that point on, there is no more interaction going on between MailStore and the Exchange server, and the user can use it. So that's how the basic authentication profile for Microsoft 365 still works, because it's still available in MailStore 13. And that is how the on-premise authentication, for example, works if you're logging in as a user that has been synchronized with a local Active Directory behind an Exchange server. In other cases, we might use with the mail server, sorry. So then we have modern authentication. That is how we authenticate users now with Microsoft 365 or Google G Suite, and there may be others in the future. because other mail servers, especially those cloud mail services, they will also move into that direction. I'm very sure. So what's happening now? The user just sends the username, and then MailStore needs to figure out, is that a user where I need to do basic authentication, or is that a user that I can authenticate myself because the password is stored in my own database? Or is it a user that I need to redirect to a third-party identity provider and expect an identity token back from the user after he authenticated with that one? So in this case, modern authentication with Microsoft 365, MailStore will return a sign-in URI of the identity provider. That means, hey, user, please open the web browser and go to that URI and authenticate there. So that is what MailStore client in that case does. It opens the web browser. That is what the Outlook add-in does. It opens the web browser. And if you're already within your web browser because you're using MailStore Web Access, that kind of happens magically because you're redirected after you send your username in MailStore Web Access. So the web browser opens or is already open, and you're being redirected to the login URL or sign-in URL of your identity provider. In that case, we talk about the Azure AD. And what happens then? What happens next? That highly depends on this conditional access policies that are defined. So if you're connecting from a secure network or the administrator hasn't defined anything, just entering your username and password in the login dialog on the Microsoft servers is typically sufficient, and the process will continue. If there are policies, you might be asked to add further information to your login, like doing multi-factor authentication. But I will show you in a live demo later anyway. That's just a few examples. So in case the authentication with the identity provider was successful, that identity provider knows to which application that user originally wanted to log in, because that is all information that is also included in this sign-in URI. There is a client ID and so on. So the identity provider looks up in his own database, okay, if the user wants to log in there, I have a client ID and there is a registered redirect URI and they are all matching. So I now redirect the user back to the original application and also have him submit an ID token. So that is what the identity provider returns, the redirect URI where the user should go next, and the ID token, that information is what the user should send to the redirect URI. And that is what the user does. It sends this information to MailStore. And MailStore first validates the ID token, so looks if all the information is correct, if the digital signature matches, and whatsoever is needed to get a certain feeling that this is the right user and that all the information in there is correct. Typically, these ID tokens also have an expiry date in it, and they have certain protection against reuse, random value that we have the user send over, and so on. I'm not going to get into all these technical details in this session because otherwise I would be talking for hours. Additionally to that, we request further user information from the identity provider because there might be other attributes like alias addresses and so on that help us to really map the MailStore user with the user that tries to log in, and that's why we're doing another request. That's kind of optional. In order to have a user log into your own service, you don't need to do that. We do that for certain reasons, but it's not part of the original authentication flow with OpenID Connect. So we get the user info back, and then we are definitely able to map the user that tried to log in to a user that we have previously synchronized, or we are not. In that case, it's an unknown user to us. And that's basically how modern authentication works with this different parties involved. All right. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Of course, the client needs to know that the user was actually authenticated, and that means inside of MailStore we mark the session as authenticated, which allows the client that is connecting to proceed further in the flow of interacting with MailStore server, or in case of MailStore Web Access, he gets certain information and is allowed to enter his archive. Of course, that's the most obvious step at the end. So with that, I would love to switch to a quick live demo. and show you what needs to be configured in order to connect MailStore with the Azure Active Directory. I'm not going through the setup steps here again because we otherwise would run out of time. But I would like to show you which information are important. So, and you should maybe get used to that kind of terminology. So I have registered an application here that's MailStore server, and in order to identify which MailStore server in my lab this is, I've entered the full host name here, but that's just a name to identify it, you as a person. The important technical information is the application ID or client ID. The client ID is a term from the OAuth standards, and maybe I recite this a little bit. It's from the OAuth standard where it says client ID, whereas in the Microsoft world, it's an application you register here. And that's a unique identifier that is assigned when you register a new application here with Microsoft. And the other thing is the directory ID or the tenant ID. That identifies your Microsoft 365 tenant. And that information we need to give MailStore in order to have MailStore redirect to the correct URIs and provide the right information. So the other important information that such an OpenID Connect authentication works is that in the identity provider here, the Azure Active Directory, you need to tell where should I redirect the user after he successfully authenticated with my identity provider. And this URL must point to the MailStore server. It's not necessary that this URI is accessible from the internet as long as the client where the user starts MailStore client or Outlook get in, so where the user tries to log in, is able to resolve this domain name. Yeah, that's the only thing that is important. So it's not like Microsoft is sending information directly here. No, it's giving this URL with additional information back to the browser of the user, and then the browser needs to be able to connect here. So in theory, you could use internal domain names here as well. For Google, this is more restricted. There you must use public internet domains, but also it's not necessary that they are accessible from the outside. Yeah, but they must be public internet domains for various other reasons. And then here, under implicit grant, I have ID tokens checked, and that means that this application expects just an ID token, which is only to verify that a user authenticated. This ID token does not allow the application to do anything on behalf of the user. That would be the case for access tokens. So this is that. And now let's talk about the authorization part. So with that kind of application registration, I can define as an administrator what this application should be allowed to do. And in order to archive messages, I have to give that application full access as application through the Exchange Web Service application. That means, okay, that application gets full access to everything that is stored on the Exchange Online. And to synchronize users, I must allow this application to read the directory data. And that is where you already see what the benefit of having this fine-grained authorization process is. Because this means, yes, you can read all users, but you cannot update users, you cannot modify users, you cannot delete users. So anyone who gets access to the credentials of this application would only have a limited scope. And if you go through that add permissions, there is a list of maybe hundreds of various fine-grained permissions here. So last but not least, we take a look at certificates and secrets. And this is what you get from MailStore, a certificate. And you upload this certificate here into the app registration, because that information is used by MailStore to identify that, hey, I'm a MailStore server, and here's my certificate. And with that certificate, you link actually the installation together with the client ID to that app. And this allows the application to actually request an access token and then talk to the Graph API or talk to Exchange Web Service in order to access real data. That's part of the authentication process for the service itself. So that is it on the that is it on the Azure AD side. Unfortunately, I was kicked out of my lab servers. Let's give it a second to reconnect here. And while it's connecting, maybe I switch back here to the app registration, and just to give you an overview how fine-grained these permissions actually are. So if you look at Microsoft Graph, which is the standard API for Microsoft 365, you have delegated permissions and you have application permissions. In a case you have an application like MailStore that is running standalone in the background as a service, it's always application permission. If you delegate permission, then the application doing something would do it on behalf of your username. That's the primary difference here. So if you scroll through all that, these are the API endpoints. And if you click here, you can see that, for example, accessing files that are stored typically on OneDrive, or accessing group information and so on. There's a bunch of things where you can set fine-grained permissions what this application should be allowed to do. So meanwhile, I'm logged into my lab server here again. So we connect to the MailStore server that is installed on this machine. I log in as the admin user because I want to show you the setup real quick. And we have the directory services. And here is modern authentication selected. And the credentials, these are stored in the brand new credential manager that we are currently using only for Microsoft 365 credentials, but that could easily be extended to other credentials as well. And if I look at the properties here, I have a name, and this is the application or client ID again, and this is a directory or tenant ID that I have to fill in here. And from here, I can download the certificate that MailStore created, and that is a certificate I have to upload to Azure to finally connect it. And that's basically it, doing the setup, of course, entering the correct redirect URI here. And the great thing about this credentials is that now I can also reuse what I've defined in the credential manager in my archive profiles. So looking at the new MailStore 365 archiving profile, I just need to select the credentials that I stored in the credential manager. Because it's the same application, the application has the right to access the mailboxes, and that's basically it. So taking a quick look how the login process looks from a user perspective, I will log in as .onmicrosoft.com. So this is a user I synchronized, and now it's opening my default web browser, which in that case is Chrome. And since I never logged in on this machine, not sure whether there was a typo. There was a typo. Okay, that's weird.
I'll tell you what, I can come back to you if you like, Daniel. I can see a few questions coming in, so I'll let you just address that for a second. I can see, Friday, you were asking about the arguments and resources around 365. I know Ross from Zen Software has covered that, but I thought it's worth mentioning. That advert you saw in the opening credits summarizes it a bit, but that was linking to the Osterman report that Ross mentioned. There's also quite a nice PDF, which is 6 reasons. So it's just a nice, concise, I think it's 2 sides, 1 side. But yeah, ideal for sharing with customers. So yeah, there's plenty. We do have the material. We're going to package it up and make it available so that you've got a content pack. But yeah, it is there. And I'll send round an email to everyone that registered for this and make sure that you get the links to it.
All right. So in the meanwhile, I managed to log in.
Okay.
Yeah, there was enforcement of changing my password recently, so I forgot about that. So as you can see, I'm now logged in as user John Doe. And what I did when logging in, I said, yeah, keep me signed in my web browser, which means the next time I log in here, I just click next and my web browser opens. And it automatically logged me in, and then brings the MailStore window to the top, and I'm in without any further entering usernames or password or anything. Unfortunately, we cannot close this window we opened. That's just not possible by security concept of Windows, but I'm in. So the next thing is I would like to show you, go back here to that client and let me show you something with the Outlook add-in. When you set up your Outlook account and connect it to Microsoft 365, you're typically asked whether you want to allow the Microsoft 365 administrator to also manage certain settings on your computer. And that box is checked by default. So that is actually the default behavior. And what that means is that it creates a link between your Windows account and your work or school account, which you can see here in Windows, that there is a work or school account, John Doe, at my domain on the Microsoft side. And that allows me to do a very neat thing, which is if I click on Browse Archive here, click on Next, and now you have to trust me that I never logged in using this Edge browser on this machine, I'm automatically signed in. And why I'm automatically signed in is because my Windows authentication here locally on my machine already enabled this work or school account to be used to do a single sign-on process, and that's completely built in between the Edge browser, the Windows operating system, and the connection that was established when setting up the mail account in Outlook. Right? So that's it. And last but not least, and then I'm already done with the live demo, is showing you how great all that looks with the MailStore web access, because you're already in a browser. In that case, I choose my account here and enter the password. Click sign in. And oh, there you go. It asked me for a text message code that I just received. So this is because I have enabled for that particular user to use multi-factor authentication based on text message codes. 6117, and I click on verify. And next it asks me to stay signed in, and yeah, this is a pretty secure device, so I don't want to get this question again, and I want to stay signed in, yes. So, and I'm in my archive, can browse my archived messages in MailStore. Now, when I close my browser and open the browser again, open web access, identify as that person, click next. You see that there is a lot of redirect going on in the background in the URL bar, and that's it, I'm in. Yeah, because my browser knows a cookie that is checked by the Azure AD authentication service, and because I said, yeah, this is a secure device, I'm no longer want to get asked for additional username, password, or MFA information. I'm signed in here. Right. So yeah, that's basically it. That was the live demo. I hope you enjoyed it, and now I'm open to question. And back to James.
Yeah, that's really cool. I noticed we're not doing great for time. That was really good, though, Daniel. The main thing here is obviously that it's more secure and it's more user friendly, which I think is just brilliant. Those two things combined. Let's do some questions, shall we? So I'm sure there'll be plenty. I can see there's been some that have been answered by the guys at Zen, and let's start with this one then. So quite a good one actually. Let's see if I can see that. So Haride is saying, are other archiving services also, do they also have this new token authentication feature, or is MailStore leading the way with this?
I have seen a few other on-premise solutions that have also started integrating it, and I think it's because of the same reasons that Microsoft and Google are deprecating basic authentication. And there are literally no other options available. I mean, that is the way you have to do it in the future. And as I mentioned, that other cloud products, cloud services, they have probably built that in from day one. Because all the cloud native applications that are based on web technologies, on 100% web technologies anyway, that have been developed in the last 5 to 10 years, they would have used that kind of authentication and OAuth and OpenID right from the beginning, because when they were born, it was already available, so it was very approachable for them. But I conclude from the question that you may ask yourself, is that just an option to do modern authentication, and is there anything else? No, there isn't really, because basic authentication is going to go away from Microsoft, from Google, and obviously from other services, and that's a good thing. What I said to the people at MailStore Tech Support is that yes, I know that this is at first place like more complicated, but you create a bigger trust relationship between the different systems, which is a good thing. And I told them at some point in the history, people got used to type in a username and a password, right? And administrators knew I have to assign a password to my user. At that time, that was maybe completely new to people. And this I see as a next step in the IT history, that we are moving away from just plain usernames and passwords, and understand that there are more flexible but more secure and better ways to authenticate users and services in this more and more complex world, which means that people working in the IT cannot really avoid getting in touch with it. This is like the way you understand how a username and password works must be the way how you learn to understand how this OpenID Connect flow and this kind of modern authentication works. If you ask me, there is no way around it, because there are no other options. And especially if the big players in the market are rising the bar, which they do, which I think is a good thing, because somebody has to make the first steps, because you see hacked accounts and account takeovers all the time in the media. That is something that makes it much harder for the attackers to get into systems and to pretend they are a different user with maybe higher privileges.
Okay, I've got Chris at LMS. They're coming in quickly. Let's. Okay, so Chris is saying, as this develops, as the modern authentication and the OpenID Connect thing moves on, are MailStore going to keep up with that?
Absolutely. So this is for us also just the first step, but it's not like these standards are changing constantly. I mean, the first implementation of OpenID for OAuth was done back in, I think, 2009, and I have watched some videos of the original inventors, and it said, yeah, we did some stuff there that is that is not considered to be really secure, but we try to solve at least some of the problems people have with basic authentication and plain text usernames and passwords. And in the meantime, clients got better. Web browsers are capable of more high sophisticated functionality. And of course, MailStore will need to keep up with that, and we will keep up with that. And let me tell you that this is just the first step from our side. And I'm pretty sure if we look closely, we could do things even better. For us, one of the most challenging things always is that we have to take a look at all the various environments and mail systems we support. And let me be honest, if we would be developing a solution that is just for Microsoft Active Directory or Microsoft Exchange Online, we could do things even a little bit better, yeah? Or let me be just open with you about that. But we have to keep in mind that the same solution and the approach we are taking also works for the majority of Google customers, iSwap, MDemon, and so on and so on. On the other hand, all these people who were used to just type in username and password are now highly affected by going through this two-step login process, which means you send a username first, and then you may send the password, yeah? Which might be disturbing for people who have used MailStore for the last 10 years and have no server that has been switched to modern authentication. So we are all currently going through a phase of change, which, yeah, due to COVID and all the other change happening in the world, is maybe not the best time to have another change, but those things already started years ago, and they keep rolling. And if you have seen this Indiana Jones movie where he's trying to run away from this huge rock rolling behind him, you cannot avoid it, right? It's just the way things are developing in the IT. Yeah, sometimes something new becomes the standard, and then you keep up with it.
And that's where I hope this session will be really useful, because the thing is, what I found out as soon as I heard about this new feature, I started Googling, and we talked about this, didn't we? There's so much help out there, but it can be quite misleading. So I hope this has been quite it's just sort of encapsulated it from a MailStore perspective. It was quite important to show it in the context of an archiving solution and Azure, not just because it can apply to all sorts of different scenarios. So hopefully that's achieved that.
Especially for an on-prem solution, I think we have done a really good job to make it as simple as possible in the end of the day, especially for the users who use it on a daily basis. And that is, that's, I think, most important, that it doesn't become a pain for the end users every day.
And Ross was just saying, I think he did avoid the rolling rock.
Yay! Great to hear.
Actually, on that note, I know there's obviously a big family of distributors out there that are working with other mail platforms. Other mail platforms are available. We do have those on-premise systems like MDaemon. And one of the questions was, are there any plans, and this sort of relates to it, are there any plans for 2FA implementation for those? So putting you on the spot a bit, but...
So you mean that having like 2FA or other login policies for environments where these settings are not managed centrally by an identity provider? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's as I understand it. Guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's it. Yeah.
That's not on the short list of features on our roadmap, honestly. Just because. Yeah, the majority of our customers, and I don't think that's a big secret, are on Microsoft 365, or at least consider moving that direction, especially if they have an on-prem Exchange server. But we will see where that route will all take us, actually. But the other thing is that there are many other products that are just doing identity that are an identity provider and that can manage all that setting centrally. And yes, while we might do our own thing with our own MFA and so on, we could do that, and it's still on the list. It's not the point, but I think it would be great if more products, like also the mail server products, would integrate themselves using these industry standard protocols into identity providers. And there are just products on the market, like there's an open source product from Red Hat, like it's called Keycloak, for example. That does all this identity providing and authorization handling on the very standard way, and you can easily connect all third-party applications to it. And my wish would be that more mail server vendors go that route and connect their services to central authorization and authentication systems, because ultimately that makes it way easier for administrators because of the one place where you need to define all the security and lock in relevant information. But yes, short answer, it's on the list, but not on the short list.
Yeah. Okay. I hope that's useful. Right. I say we'll probably have maybe another 5 minutes. So if anyone's got any other questions they want to pop in the chat, feel free. I got a few when people were registering for the session. One of them, quite an important point, is what happens if I upgrade but I don't implement the modern authentication stuff? Now, I've had this talking to some partners. They assume that if they upgrade straight away, it switches over.
No, that's not the case. As I said in my presentation, the old profile is now called Microsoft 365 Basic Authentication. That still exists and provides exact the functionality that has been there in all the previous versions of MailStore. Let me quickly show you here. But it's not us who will break things that have been working, because if Microsoft really turns off basic authentication, that will be the time where these profiles will no longer work, and you will no longer be able to synchronize users, and you will no longer be able to archive messages if you haven't migrated. But as I heard, existing customers, so if you have customers using that profile, they will not be affected by the change on the Microsoft side before the second half of 2021. That is what at least I have read in a recent update from the Microsoft side. But as you can see here, both are side by side. It's basic authentication and modern authentication. And after the update, your existing profile will just have a different name, but it will have exactly the same functionality as before.
Terrific. Okay. One question.
And maybe to mention the documentation that guides you through the migration process that is currently under review and will be released also soon.
Yes, we've got some good knowledge base articles and videos, I think, to go with them, so they'll be on their way.
Mm-hmm. That's all in production.
Yeah, terrific. Okay. So we've got a question from Zen. Will MailStore alert via the main dashboard or status report when the authentication certificate expires? It appears that they last for 2 years from creation.
Yeah, that's correct. Now you got me.
It had to happen once in this session, didn't it?
That is, that is definitely something I would have to look up. I mean, there are certain things that just happen magically in the background because my guys on the team just think about it, and if things expire, make sure we put it on the dashboard. I would have to look it up. I'll follow up with you guys later on that question. I would assume yes. And if not, you already found an improvement or a bug, and we may include it in one of the version 13 updates.
Very good. Pesky Brits. In the situation where MS Cloud might be down or unavailable, presumably that would mean that you can no longer log into MailStore either.
Mm-hmm. That is correct. That's that's the problem with having central authentication systems or with centralized systems anyway. Yeah. And that might happen, but the good thing is you can always log into MailStore as the admin, and if nothing else works, you could recreate the local admin with a new password with a locksmith function, and if you expect the outage will be of a longer time because maybe your internet connection is down and it takes 2 days to restore it, then of course you can go into these users, change from directory service to MailStore integrated, and define a password manually and give it to them. So this is like the kind of disaster scenario where you, as the admin, may switch over to MailStore integrated to give users access to their data.
Okay. I'm going to make this the last one then, Daniel, I think. I've got Sebastian Schultz is asking, will there be ADFS integration at some point?
That is currently actually not planned because I am not sure if real ADFS integration directly with MailStore will have any benefit. We have not looked, honestly, into if you have an ADFS integration with Microsoft Azure AD, how that looks. I would expect that in case you connected your local Active Directory with ADFS to Azure AD, your users will be redirected by the Microsoft identity provider to your ADFS, and then they authenticate with your local Active Directory, and then they are routed all the way back. Good question, but I know that I haven't tested that and I have looked into that, but a direct integration between MailStore and ADFS is something we don't have on the list because that is also not ADFS is like what was before Microsoft developed the Graph API and was started relying on standards like OAuth and all that. There is SAML authentication and other mechanisms that are being used. That is something we're definitely not looking into it because that is definitely not to be defined the future for authentication mechanisms.
Okay, I think that wraps it up. Then we've gone a little bit over time, but that's been really good. Daniel, I think I'm going to get you on every week or we should definitely do it more regularly though, but maybe we'll talk about that offline. I think it's been really useful for everyone and hopefully it's been educational and enjoyable. So we'll wrap it up there, I think. Any closing words before I cut you off rudely?
No. It was a pleasure for me to guide you all through this. I can imagine there will be a lot of more questions. Feel free to shoot them over to James, and he will filter them for me. Yeah,
thanks so much for that. Yeah. Partners at MailStore.
I mean, if there are other topics you want to have me invited to and share knowledge with you guys, I'm happy to do that. And
Brilliant. Okay, listen, thanks to
Thank you
everyone in
very
the chat. Thank you to you and to everyone in the chat. Joan, Ross, Chris, Sebastian, everyone else. Sorry, the list has got a little bit long for me to see on my screen. But yeah, thank you for everyone that spent the time with us. It's a good hour today. So I'll just wrap up very quickly with the final thoughts. So there's a couple of things to be aware of. First of all, if you want to look into this, then maybe use your not for resale license. So if you haven't got one, use that for testing this out before you obviously go onto a live customer site. It's definitely worth getting familiar with the new features. So use that. If you haven't got one already, then request it from your distributor or from us if you work with us directly. Obviously, get out there and upgrade your customers. Get them upgraded to version 13 if you can. I put watch vendor news on there to keep an eye out for what Google and Microsoft are saying, but obviously, I think it's a good idea to work on the October deadline if you can, really, and just get it moving as soon as possible. Get your people upgraded. Last but not least, we have a special promotion which is running till the end of August, which you definitely want to be aware of. So if you're not totally familiar with the MailStore licensing already, you buy it up front and then it's 25% of the new price to renew it thereafter. If you let it expire, it goes up to 70%. So if you've perhaps neglected the renewal because maybe it was during the particularly bad time, certainly in Europe for the pandemic, where you're looking to cut costs, or the customers were looking to shave costs. If it's just one of those things, people just ignore these or forget about them for whatever reason, you've now got an even better reason in version 13 to get these people upgraded. So it's the promotion is 50% off if you've got an expired license. So if you've got one of these licenses that would normally be 70% of the new price to renew, then you can basically just do that. It's applied automatically for us. Speak to your distributors about getting that. I think most of the guys have got that implemented already. So throughout August, it's a great time to be getting your MailStore customers up to date. If you want any help with materials, obviously speak to your disties, speak to us. We can help with. We've got a Why Renew PDF, which is more general arguments. But use us. We're on hand to help with any marketing stuff. And as I say, I'll send around some useful links after this. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the next one. So thank you for your time again. We're well over, but I really appreciate it and hope to speak to you all soon. All right, take care. Bye, everyone.